Hello and welcome to the National Gallery, and it's really wonderful to be back in the theatre. It's the first time in 18 months we've been able to hold something here in person. So welcome and thank you very much for coming in, and thank you to those listening and following online as well. My name's Letizia Treves and I'm the James and Sarah Sassoon Curator of the later Italian, Spanish and French 17th century pictures, and I'm the curator also of Bellotto, the Königstein Views Reunited. So today, I want to transport you to Königstein, a medieval fortress sitting on a rocky outcrop about 25 miles southeast of Dresden in eastern Germany, situated in the Elbe Valley. It's the subject of 5 spectacular views by the 18th century view painter Bernardo Bellotto, which are reunited here at the National Gallery for the very first time in more than 250 years. Now, I've longed to bring these pictures together ever since we acquired the view of the fortress from the north in 2017. This picture was export stopped and then it was saved for the nation thanks to the generosity of a number of private individuals, foundations, the Art Fund, and a very generous legacy gift. And now the National Gallery finally owns a painting whose scale and ambition can really affirm Bellotto's reputation as one of the most original view painters of the 18th century. Now, the 5 views of Königstein date from what is widely regarded as a high point in Bellotto's career. 1756 marks the end of his most productive decade, spent as court painter in Dresden, working for the Elector of Saxony, Frederick Augustus II, also known as Augustus III, King of Poland. Now, for him, Bellotto painted a series of 30 views of Dresden and its surroundings. They're all on a very similar scale, on a very large format. Now, most of them are still in Dresden in the Gemälde Gallery, and they've been undergoing a comprehensive restoration program over several years, and they will all be featuring in a major bicentenary exhibition in 2022. Now, the Königstein Views originally formed part of that larger cycle. They were certainly completed and paid for, but unlike the rest of the group today in Dresden, they were probably never delivered to their royal patron. At the onset of the 7 Years' War and the Prussian invasion of Saxony in 1756, which is the year in which we know Bellotto was at Königstein making drawings, the Elector barricaded himself inside the fortress for several months with 2 of his sons and his Prime Minister, Count Heinrich von Brühl. Now, when the Elector fled for Poland soon after, Bellotto also left Saxony, and we don't know what happened to the paintings. They seem to have made their way to Britain in the late 18th century, and they may have been taken here by the Prime Minister's nephew, who was actually appointed ambassador in London in 1764. Now, by then, Bellotto would have lost his patron because the Elector had died, and he probably had to sell these pictures. They'd already been split from the rest of the group. We know the 5 paintings probably arrived in Britain together, but they were soon split into 2 groups. The 2 courtyard scenes, or internal views, were at auction in the 1770s, and they remain together. These are both today now in Manchester City Art Gallery. They were bought in the early 1980s, and you can see in this picture that they have matching frames. These are English 18th century frames. And the 3 exterior views were purchased in the early 1790s by the 2nd Viscount Palmerston and sold in around 1850 by his son. These are today the picture you can see on the screen here at the National Gallery, in the Derby collection at Knowsley, and at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And once again, they all have matching frames. Now, although Bellotto spent a large proportion of his life in Eastern and Northern Europe, he was actually born in Venice. He trained in the studio of his uncle, the famous view painter Canaletto, and his early Venetian views are indebted to his master. Now, in his lifetime, Bellotto was known as Canaletto, meaning little canal, and in Britain he was also known as Canaletti or Canalettino, as you can see on the tag on one of the frames in the exhibition. This view of Venice, that's actually in the National Gallery, was painted when Bellotto was just 16 years old, in around 1738. This is the year in which he entered the Fraglia dei Pittori, the Venetian Painters Guild. The painting was long thought to be by Canaletto, ever since it entered the collection in 1910, because of its dependency on a Canaletto drawing in the royal collection. But we also know of a drawing of the same site by Bellotto, and scholars now generally agree that Bellotto's drawing actually came first, and Canaletto's reworked that of his nephew. Either way, it's certainly obvious that these two artists worked very closely together. And although Bellotto may not yet have mastered the quality or the subtlety of Canaletto's technique, look, for example, in particular at the sort of spindly figures and the somewhat sort of mechanical way of painting water compared to Canaletto in this much larger picture of around the same date. But what Bellotto does is he already demonstrates a great sensitivity to atmospheric effects and to the changing weather. And this is something you see also later on in his work, especially in the Königstein Views. Look at this detail of the sky, these very bold diagonal brushstrokes in the clouds, and the streaky haze on the horizon where he paints wet on wet. This thickly applied paint gives the picture a very richly surfaced texture, and this is to become one of the characteristics of Bellotto's later works. Now, as well as teaching him how to paint, Canaletto instilled in Bellotto a rigorous drawing technique, and he also taught him how to use the camera obscura, or pinhole camera, which is something we know that both artists used extensively to compose their views. Now, the box on the left is actually inscribed A Canal on the protective cover, suggesting that it may even have belonged to Canaletto. Now, the camera obscura was made up of a wooden box fitted with a lens through which an image would be projected upside down on an angled mirror, and you can see that's the M here. This image would then be reflected and turned the right way up onto a polished surface up here. And an artist would lay a very thin sheet of paper over this to draw architectural details and individual buildings with great precision. The camera obscura was an essential tool for anyone wanting to replicate a view with topographical accuracy. And the sharp recession and distorted perspective in some of Bellotto's paintings are certainly evidence of him using a camera. And you can also see a lot of his drawings have these very strong perspectival lines. Now, the young Bellotto didn't just paint Venice. He expanded his repertoire by traveling around northern Italy. His views of Florence and Turin, especially, are highly original. These cities had never been painted by Canaletto before, and so Bellotto had to devise his own pictorial solutions. He was naturally drawn to representing features that were familiar from Venice: squares framed by imposing buildings, waterways lined with palaces, and figures going about their daily business. Now, in the two pendants of Turin, which were actually Bellotto's first royal commission, he combines features that also reappear in his views of Königstein. You see these vast atmospheric skies, sharply receding architecture, crumbling brickwork and plasterwork, figures chatting, and even washerwomen laying out their laundry. They're also painted on a large scale. The Königstein Views are even larger, measuring almost 2.5 meters in width. But this is a format that was perfectly suited to Bellotto's expansive views, and he adopted this grand scale for dozens of views and paintings that he produced later in his career. Another thing that's interesting in thinking about these two views of Turin is that Bellotto often conceived of his views in pairs or even in groups or series, often showing the same spot either in the same direction under different weather conditions or from different angles, for example, looking up or downstream at different times of day, or as I say, in different weather conditions. And this places you as a viewer inside his pictorial space, and it makes for a very dynamic viewing experience. And this, of course, reaches its culmination in the 3 exterior views of the fortress of Königstein, where we're really invited to follow in Bellotto's footsteps and circumvent the site anti-clockwise. And this is something I really wanted to replicate in the exhibition, so that you'll see when you go and see the exhibition, if you haven't already, you stand in the middle of the room and you're surrounded by the views, and you really feel like you're walking around the site in a sequence. Now, shortly after Canaletto's departure for England in 1746, Bellotto himself left Venice. He was just 22 years old, and he headed northwards through Europe, arriving in Dresden in 1747. Now, within a year, he had entered the service of the Elector, whose father, Augustus the Strong, had assembled an outstanding collection of works of art antiquities and porcelain, and was also responsible for a number of major building projects in the city. And many of the landmarks are actually captured by Bellotto, and these were built under Augustus the Strong, such as the Sfinger Palace, the Frauenkirche, or the Augustus Bridge, which you can see here and here from a different angle. Now, Bellotto soon became the highest paid court artist, and we know that he lived in relative luxury. His apartment in Dresden was elegantly furnished and decorated with paintings, drawings, engravings, and even a printing press. Here, Bellotto paints himself seated and conversing with two other established court painters, Johann Alexander Thiele, who was the Prospektmaler, so the painter of prospects or views to the elector, and Christian Wilhelm Dietrich. When Bellotto was charged with painting Königstein in the mid-1750s, he'd already completed 25 views of Dresden and its surroundings. There were 14 of the city itself, organized in pairs, and 11 of Pirna, a small settlement not far from Dresden. And you can imagine how the fortress of Sonnenstein and Pirna, and also the fortress of Königstein, really presented Bellotto with the chance to compose these sort of breathtaking views with these very daring perspectives. He wasn't actually the only one to appreciate the dramatic possibilities of these sites, because Turner drew the exact same views about 80 years later in his Dresden and Saxon Switzerland sketchbook. Königstein is one of the largest hilltop fortifications in Europe, comprising of about 50 buildings, many of which feature in Bellotto's views. Königstein means literally stone of the king, and this site is steeped in history. It was built as a medieval castle. The first mention is actually in 1241, and it was originally part of the territories of the Kingdom of Bohemia. And in the early 15th century, it was transferred to the Wettin, the House of Wettin, and it became an important military outpost. And then the members of the Wettin dynasty went on to be electors of Saxony. After a brief stint as a monastery, Königstein was actually turned into a fortress. In the 16th and 17th century, and certainly by the time Bellotto was painting there, it was used as a royal retreat, a place for leisure pursuits and festivities. And a well was installed in the 1560s, and of course this meant that Königstein could function autonomously, as it has its own water source. By the time Bellotto was there, the fortress's defences had been much improved, and there were new barracks. Then during the 7 Years' War, it was also used for safekeeping, for the art treasures from the royal picture galleries. Many of those were packed up and dispatched to various locations, including Königstein, and the same happened again during the Second World War. In the 19th century, it was a state prison, a military hospital, and a prisoner of war camp. And it had the same role, actually, in the First and Second World War. Now, since the 1950s, Königstein has been a museum, and it remains one of Saxony's most popular outside tourist attractions, nestled in an area of outstanding natural beauty known as Saxon Switzerland. As you can see from these photographs, it really hasn't changed very much. Reuniting Bellotto's views of Königstein is a truly remarkable experience. If you could play the video, please. Bellotto himself may have been among the very last people to see these pictures gathered together in one room. There you go. And Bellotto wasn't, of course, the first person to portray Königstein, but his approach was unprecedented. He chose to paint the fortress on a monumental scale, both from inside and outside its forbidding walls, with remarkable clarity and attention to detail. And you really do get the sense that you are physically present when you look at Bellotto's paintings. Johann Alexander Thiele, the other court painter I mentioned earlier, had already painted Königstein. In this picture on the left, it's on a much smaller scale than Bellotto's. But you can see what a sort of romantic view of Königstein it is, and it's almost painted like a sort of bird's eye view, as is indeed, you can compare that directly with the same viewpoint by Bellotto. But indeed the same could be said of this engraving, taken from a distance and somewhat sort of romanticized. Now, we know Bellotto made some very detailed drawings in situ. There's an electoral decree, which I'm showing you now, that asks officials to assist him and give him privileged access to the fortress. Now, Bellotto in this document is referred to as Canaletto, the name by which he was widely known in the 18th century, as I've already mentioned. The drawings were probably completed in the spring or summer of 1756, but none of these have survived. They must have been numerous and must have consisted of some sheets with very detailed drawings of individual buildings, as well as wider panoramas. And these would later have been combined to create more complex compositions in the studio, adding the figures and animals last. Now, these figures, particularly the ones in the foreground, are based frequently on figures that he took from engravings. Some are based from drawings of figures done from life, but the majority, as I say, are taken from engravings after Francesco Zuccarelli, an 18th century Venetian painter, and also after Nicolaas Berchem, a 17th century Dutch artist. This is the painting today in the National Gallery. As I've shown already, it's one of the 3 exterior views of Königstein. Bellotto's viewpoint is taken from the north, so we're very close to the site, and it's from quite a low vantage point, which allows him to exaggerate the scale of the fortress and set its jagged profile against this pale sky. The day is coming to a close, the sun is dipping, the shadows becoming longer. At the right edge, we see the silhouette of a shepherd leaning wearily on a cow after a long day in the sun. Bellotto brilliantly conveys the different textures of the fortress in this picture, from the kind of blotchy, mottled facades of buildings to the crumbling plasterwork and the thin, regular bricks. The light catches the sharp edges of battlements and window frames, painted with almost miniaturist precision. And this contrasts with the very free handling of paint in the dense thicket of trees beneath, or even the light dots and squiggles that indicate figures at the foot of the fortress. Bellotto's depiction is so accurate that you can actually identify many of the buildings even today. At the far left is the Friedrichsburg, or Frederick's Castle. This was a 16th century watchtower, which by the time Bellotto was at Königstein had been converted into an ornate Baroque pavilion. This was a venue for courtly festivities, and it had been struck by lightning in 1744, about a decade before Bellotto was there, and it was no longer in use. But Bellotto faithfully records its boarded-up window. Further along to the right is the Röschen, a tall, narrow observation tower. It has a very distinctive profile, and the tower is linked to the fortress by a small bridge. You can see the arch of the bridge here in the shadow across the uneven rock face. This is clearer still in the Washington view, where the tower is viewed side on. The main focus, however, of our view here in the National Gallery, that actually forms a kind of pinnacle at the center, is the Georgenberg. This was part of the original medieval site, and it was transformed into a Renaissance-style hunting lodge in the early 17th century. At the far end of the complex is the commandant's house. You can see the same gleaming facade in Bellotto's view of the fortress, one of the interior courtyards, which I'm showing you here on the left. Just to the right of this is the Horn Promontory. Now, beneath the ramparts, you can see the workmen building a new defensive platform, which was known as the Flèche, which, as the name suggests, was used to fire arrows over the surrounding area. Flèche meaning arrow in French. Now, this was built in about 1755 to 56, so it was clearly underway when Bellotto was doing his drawings there, but it had been almost certainly completed by the time he'd actually got to painting these views, and you can see the scaffolding poles very clearly. This platform, the Flèche platform, is also visible from the other side in the Washington picture, which shows the fortress from the northwest. It's as if Bellotto's just walked around the corner of the site anti-clockwise. This view is the most atmospheric of all 3 exterior views, and it's the only one in which Bellotto's viewpoint is taken from further away, as if he's standing on a nearby hillock. The towering fortress dominates the right part of the composition, which Bellotto has opened up on the left so we can see into the distance. Now, the wide-angle view is also very theatrical, and in the foreground, figures rest on a mound, spotlit, as if on a stage. And Bellotto articulates this receding landscapes with patches of sunlight and then deep, dark shadows. The sun is high in the sky. You can see the short shadow cast by the horse-drawn cart at the far right. So this suggests, obviously, it's the middle of the day. The horizon is dominated by Lilienstein, a sandstone mound that still exists today. And you can see, it's really unchanged, and the woodland all surrounding it. Beside this, Bellotto has painted thundery clouds and a heavy downpour. These bold diagonal strokes suggest pounding rain. And Bellotto's managed to conjure up this sort of fleeting moment through a very kind of palpable atmosphere in the picture. And yet you feel the permanence of the site through the fortress's austere, towering and unmoving presence. The structure of the Georgenberg, which was the pinnacle of the National Gallery view, is now dwarfed by the rock face and also by the ramparts. And if you look closely, you can make out the roofs of barracks over the top of the walls. Here. And the small dome here of the Siegerturm, which breaks the profile. Now, this bell tower, which had functioned as both a watchtower and a clock since 1601, as you can see from the photograph, remains exactly the same. When you stand in front of this painting, you're immediately drawn to the looming presence of the fortress, but you also soon notice a hive of activity around it. There are loaded horse-drawn carts making their way up sandy tracks, shepherds tending their flocks, travellers meandering along paths. One also seems to be heading for a dark hole set into the hillside, probably a gunpowder magazine. The fortress had been standing here for 600 years by the time Bellotto painted it, but you really get a sense of life around it, having never stood still. The third exterior view is taken from the southwest, and it gives us an entirely different perspective of the fortress. For a start, we see very little of life on the inside, or indeed of buildings within its walls. We only catch a glimpse of the peaked roof of the old armory, about 2/3 of the way across. To the left of it, on a promontory, is a small domed roof silhouetted against the sky. And below it, there's a wooden scaffold. And this was actually a crane lift, which since the 16th century had been used to lever goods up into the fortress. At the foot of the crane, hidden from view, runs a track. You can see the rear end of a loaded cart here disappearing, and also the top of a shed with sentinels standing guard. And Bellotto really relishes the opportunity here to paint the sort of craggy rock foundations and contrast them with these sort of smooth sandstone walls above. This is a picture of what it is actually like, and you can see how faithful he is in representing that. Now, it's not hard to imagine where Bellotto must have positioned himself to draw this particular view at the side of the track, running where the slope ends and the woodland begins. And as with his other views of Königstein, he must have done numerous drawings. The foreshortening and the sharply receding walls do suggest he used, again, a camera obscura. The trees framing the right edge of the composition were adjusted or maybe even added at quite a late stage in the painting process. If I show you a detail, you can see where Bellotto has altered the foliage. You can see the ghostly shapes through the sky where the paint has become a little thinner. Now, Bellotto interrupts our view of the fortress by placing two trees right in front of it, their soft, fluffy forms breaking up the hard lines of the fortress behind. And these trees are painted in a much freer manner, almost impressionistically, especially in the low-lying shrubs, and it's a real contrast to the crisp outline of the ramparts and the crenellated ramparts above. Bellotto is such a master at bringing certain details into focus whilst intentionally pushing others back, and he really uses the variety of touch to do that, to shape the way you look at his picture. And here, once again, Bellotto has borrowed motifs for engravings after Bechem and Zuccarelli. You can see here the entire shepherd group in the foreground, as well as the cow beyond, is actually derives from this engraving. Now, in this very carefully constructed view of the interior of Königstein, Bellotto really shows off his mastery of perspective, and once again the use of a camera. This sharply receding path on the left and the spiny row of chimneys on the rooftop of the old barracks on the right really help lead your eye to the centre of the composition, to the Brunnenhaus, or the well house. This is where the well, providing the fortress with fresh water, was housed. And the building was erected about 20 years before Bellotto was actually there. But it remains largely unchanged to this day. The well, which is over 150 metres deep, was actually operated by soldiers walking on a treadwheel, and it had to take almost 29,000 steps a day to bring up enough water. The interior courtyard views give such a vivid sense of life inside the fortress, and in particular the sort of blend of civilian and military life. You can't see anything of Königstein's dramatic setting here, so you'd be forgiven for thinking this is just a regular town in a regular location. The White House dominating the left side of the composition is the Commandant's house, as I've already noted. And in front, in the centre, is its walled garden. If you look closely here, there's a gardener stooping to tend to the shrubs and the flower beds while an elegant couple go for a stroll nearby. And the manicured garden is a little at odds with the dilapidated state of the garden wall in the foreground, where a woman sits, accompanied by a young boy and a dog. Round the corner, just in the shade, is a young man leaning against the wall with a stick. He may be an injured soldier. And beyond him, you can see 3 soldiers marching past an elderly man who perhaps may be a retired officer now in plain clothes. A senior military figure is accompanied by other red-coated officers, and a little behind them is a shaven-headed man in Polish national costume. He's wearing a green kontusz or tunic here. Now, men wearing Polish national costume must have been a common sight at the court of Augustus III, who was also King of Poland as well as the Elector of Saxony, and they frequently appear in Bellotto's paintings from his later years in Warsaw. I'm showing you here a detail of a painting commemorating the election of the subsequent King of Poland, Poniatowski, and you can see the same green tunic there. Now, the buildings in the view on the left are seen from the other side in the second courtyard view, which is also in Manchester. This is the 5th and final painting of the Königstein series. The square tower of St. George's Church, let me show it to you here, is instantly recognisable from both angles, and it's clearly visible in this near-contemporary engraving. Also distinctive is the octagonal tower, which you can also see in another engraving from the same series. Now, this northern Renaissance-style castle is known as the Magdalenenburg, and you can see its capped dome is just visible over the roof here. Now, St. George's Church was originally built as a chapel for the medieval castle, and it remains pretty much the same. But the Magdalenenburg, as you can see, is really quite different. Gone is its intricate stone portal here, and very little of its elegant exterior remains. Now, it had been built for courtly festivities in the 17th century, and it was still being used in this way when Bellotto was there. Its cellar, located at the rear of the building, here, you can actually see it because of the 3 shuttered windows, and there are 3 circular ventilation points as well. So the cellar housed the largest wine barrel in the world. It was a cask that could hold 60,000 gallons of wine. And as you can see, this is what it looked like in a near-contemporary engraving. It had been designed in the early 1720s by the celebrated architect Puppelmann, who'd helped to rebuild much of Dresden after a devastating fire. And as you can see from the engraving, on top of the cask was a platform that allowed up to sort of 30 dancing couples So it must have been quite a fun sight during festivities. The cask was finally decommissioned in 1818, and the Magdalenenberg was turned into an ammunition store, so that's probably when its exterior was also changed. Now, in this view, what takes center stage is, of course, the Magdalenenberg building, but also the space around it. Washerwomen chatter as they lay out their laundry on the grass to dry, and you can see sheets, smocks, and aprons all hanging off their makeshift lines. In the same way that Bellotto paints shepherds and travellers in the countryside surrounding Königstein, here he offsets the washerwomen's mundane everyday task against a rather austere formal backdrop of the buildings inside the fortress. A little distance away on the same lawn, there are a couple in conversation with a small dog at their feet. At the front of the Magdalenenberg, figures can be seen chatting on the steps. There's a lady with a parasol accompanied by two gentlemen who seems to be admiring the portal of the building. And in the foreground, two simply dressed men carry heavy loads, pausing to exchange a few words. The midday sun shines bright, illuminating a neatly fenced lawn just around the corner. The figures are seen disappearing off down a ramp or slope, presumably leading to the outside world, a world that we're very gently reminded of at far left, where we catch a glimpse of the rolling Saxon countryside on the horizon. Bellotto vividly conveys the world before him, but he also tantalizingly suggests a life outside of the picture space. The 5 Views of Königstein were to be the very last Bellotto painted for the Elector. The whole Dresden series had taken him just over a decade. On average, he'd completed one large painting every sort of 12 to 16 weeks. So the Königstein series would probably have taken him 2 years to complete. And obviously, he would have been working on multiple canvases at once. And when the Prussian army advanced on Dresden in the summer of 1756, Bellotto had probably started painting already. The Königstein paintings mark a very significant moment in Bellotto's personal and professional life. Of course, it's the end of what had been the most fruitful decade of his career to date, and they also signal the moment in which the artist's fortunes changed. Because with the Elector gone, Bellotto lost his most important patron, and of course, job security. So he was forced to seek employment elsewhere. He travelled to Vienna and Munich, and then returned to Dresden in 1761 to find the city in ruins. A week-long Prussian bombardment of the city the previous year had destroyed a great deal, including Bellotto's own apartment, which was basically obliterated, and everything within it. So from his position as the highest paid artist at court, Bellotto was now facing financial ruin. And yet Bellotto went on to paint for another 20 years. He took up a temporary teaching post at the newly founded Academy of Fine Arts in Dresden as associate professor of perspective. It was a humiliating situation to find himself in. Bellotto earned a fraction of his former salary as court painter, and he clashed with the Academy's director, Hagedorn, who openly disliked him. He wrote of Bellotto, "He loses no opportunity of bringing up the subject of his dreary art and his enormous family." Bellotto was also criticised for his very poor command of the German language, despite having lived in Saxony for 15 years. We know that his son, Lorenzo, often acted as interpreter during classes. And so Bellotto resolved to go to St. Petersburg in the hope that the Empress Catherine the Great might employ him. But on the way, he stopped in Warsaw, and he never left. He was appointed court painter to Stanislaw II August Poniatowski, the King of Poland. Bellotto summoned his wife and daughters to Warsaw. It was a position as court painter that really earned him a handsome salary and went some way towards Bellotto reclaiming his former status. But the views of Warsaw that he produced for the king were heavily politicized, and many were actually painted in collaboration with his son Lorenzo. The views are arranged in what is known as the Canaletto room in the royal castle, and as you can see, they're stacked high, filling the antechamber to the throne room. It was a room through which every visiting dignitary would have passed, and they serve a clear political function. Many of the paintings are complex, ambitious, multifigural compositions. It's as if Bellotto was trying to pack too much into them. They don't, to me at least, have the same level of sophistication or inspiration or originality of his Dresden views of some 20 years earlier. That said, Bellotto's views of Warsaw are astounding for their topographical accuracy. So carefully are the buildings recorded that his views of the city were used as points of reference in reconstructing Warsaw following its destruction during the Second World War. The display at the National Gallery marks an important moment in history, and it really came about with the intention of celebrating our acquisition of this picture, an outstanding view by Bernardo Bellotto, and it marks a historic reuniting of the Königstein Views. Painted at the pinnacle of his career, these 5 magnificent paintings show the artist at his best, choreographing highly complex original compositions with unusual viewpoints, daring perspectives, and demonstrating a mastery of the paint medium that surpasses even that of his uncle, Canaletto. Each view is a real masterpiece, but together they're greater than the sum of their parts. I really hope you'll get a chance to see the exhibition if you haven't already. It is free and it runs until the 31st of October. Also, I just want to mention, if you'd like to join, there's a free online lecture on Tuesday, the 28th of September at 6:30 p.m. London time, details of which are on our website. A lecture by Edgar Peters-Bauern, who's a great expert on 18th century view painting, and he'll be looking at the Dresden series in the wider context of Bellotto's career. Thank you very much indeed.